I think we're ready. There's an audience already, so we can say hello and welcome to our audience and to our guests. And I should say that my name is Trine Flockhart. I'm a professor at the University of Southern Denmark and one of the directors of Center for War Studies here at the University of Southern Denmark. And this event or this webinar is the first of a new series of short, sharp events about conversations on a topical issue between a scholar and a practitioner. Although I have to say that in this case, it's a little bit difficult to say where you belong, Jamie. So today you are here as the practitioner because there's no doubt that Mark is the scholar, but I know that you also have a scholar hat on as well. So as I said, this is the first of a series of these kinds of conversations. They will only be about 30 minutes. And what we intend to do with these conversations is that we will pick a topical subject. In this case, it is the upcoming NATO Summit in next month, 14th of June. And we would like to hear a little bit more than what has been given in terms of details from the Secretary General of NATO, for example, about what we can expect to see in this upcoming summit. What is it that is? What can we definitely expect? And do you have any suggestions, perhaps, for any surprises? And what are going to be the sticking points? And I think it's fair to say that this is not just any ordinary NATO summit, because after 4 years of, how can I put it, not very constructive NATO summits, there's really a lot of expectations attached to this particular summit, that this may be a new start, it may be an opportunity to rekindle relationships, it may be an opportunity to actually get some constructive work done. So we're really looking forward to hearing what your views on this as absolutely renowned NATO experts, what do you think may be coming? And to our audience, I should say that we've agreed that Jamie and Mark will start out with some opening statements. And after that, there will be a chance to either for me to ask questions or for the audience to ask questions, which you can do through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I will then have a look what we have time for and bunch questions together. Now, with that, I don't think I will take more of our precious now 26 minutes. So I will not introduce you. Your details are on the website, and you can go in, and I'm sure if you Google Mark and Jamie, there's a bit of an afternoon's work in doing that anyway. But I just want to thank you for agreeing to have come here. Now, Mark, you are the guest, because one thing I should say before we start is that Jamie, apart from all the things that you can read about on the website, of course, Jamie Shea is also our president of Center for War Studies, and we are really pleased, that you are our president, and also that we could make the diary puzzle fall into place, so that the first of these new conversations is with Jamie as a participant. But that's also why you go last, because you're not a guest, and Mark is a guest.
That's right.
Yes. So Mark, the floor is yours. Let's hear what you think is in store next month.
Sure. Sure. Well, it's an honour to be here as guest, and it's always good to be with Trine and Jamie talking about my favourite subject, which is NATO. So the brief was to give views on what to expect from the NATO summit, and then to hold in reserve, if you like, one big issue to expand upon if necessary. So I'm aware that the clock is ticking, so I'll be as brief as I can. So the NATO summit occurs, as I'm sure you all know, in the middle of June. This is a particularly busy time, especially for the President of the United States. This will be his first visit to Europe since his election. And as well as the NATO summit, he will also be attending the G7 meeting in the United Kingdom in Cornwall. There is a meeting with the European Council, and if all goes to plan, a meeting with Vladimir Putin in Geneva. So a significant week of work, and significant also because this is occurring in person rather than virtually. And it is good to see diplomacy returning to the way it's done best, which is in person. So a busy time for the president, and of course in the middle of that is also the NATO summit. So the Canadians don't feel snubbed. This will also be Justin Trudeau's first visit across the Atlantic since the pandemic as well. Okay, so I see the summit as being determined by 5 drivers, if you like. So briefly, the first are the sort of ongoing threats and risks which NATO always has to deal with, the sorts of things you'd read about in national strategies: Russia, China, terrorism, climate change, and public health pandemics, and of course COVID-19 being in there. The second big driver is NATO's ongoing agenda, issues which are firmly established, some of which are of long standing, but in a sense all urgent and important. Afghanistan, the withdrawal from, which I can elaborate upon, Iraq and the NATO training mission in Iraq, the much smaller mission in Kosovo, ongoing discussions about defense budgets. The third driver will be the national priorities of what you might call the convening powers in the alliance. The most important, of course, being the United States, and with a president much more amenable to NATO than the previous one. It's already clear that the summit agenda is being determined in many ways by the discussions in Washington. And I'll say a little bit in a minute how I think that will work through into the actual conference agenda. The second convening power of note is the United Kingdom. After Brexit, the United Kingdom is doubling down on its commitment to the alliance. And you would expect the United Kingdom to play its traditional role in trying to shape some of the big issues. France, often a little bit invisible in summit agendas other than when it's causing trouble, as was the case in 2019 with the NATO brain dead comment. But France behind the scenes has been quite constructive. The Secretary General visited Macron recently, and there was a very useful discussion between the two on the upcoming summit. And interestingly, Germany will face elections in September. A new chancellor, a new government will be elected. It's not entirely clear what that government will look like at the moment. The Greens are actually ahead in the polls in Germany. But if one were to assume it was the CDU in coalition of some sort, that means we should pay attention to the comments of Armin Laschet, the incoming likely leader of the CDU, who's been fairly tough on saying Germany should meet its 2% defense spending commitment. So we may get a German input onto a stronger statement, along with US support for a statement on defense budgets. So the convening powers is the third driver. The fourth is, if you like, what you might call NATO's homework, stuff that's largely hidden, but nonetheless very important to the inner workings of the alliance. And it would be timely that some of these would make an appearance, even though probably only mentioned in brief. the most important of which I'll say a bit in a moment, which is the NATO 2030 agenda. A report was signed off earlier in the year, but that is an initial step to work on a new strategic concept to replace that of 2010. NATO has been working on two military strategic concepts recently, a so-called warfighting capstone concept and a new concept for deterrence and defense. We will probably see some coded mention of those. We may well see an updated or a reference to the need to update NATO's baseline requirements on resilience. Those date back to 2016, but in light of COVID and issues to do with cyber security, probably due an update. And one I think is interesting is the Women, Peace and Security agenda in NATO. The policy there was last updated in 2018, but from an unusual source, which was the meeting of the chiefs of heads of defense in the NATO Military Committee a couple of weeks ago. There was a long public report on the WPS agenda coming out of all places, the NATO Military Committee, and that may indicate an interesting straw in the wind, that there is something in the offing in that regard. And then the last driver are the sort of tag-ons. If it's to be a long NATO communique along the lines of the Brussels meeting in 2018, we will probably expect a comment or two on the recent issues in Belarus, Yemen, Israel, probably all fairly neutral with the exception of Belarus, but NATO summits often have a sort of panoramic quality, taking on board recent issues. So in that light, what can we expect on the day itself? Trine mentioned, to try and avoid what the SecGen has said, he has referred to 8 core proposals for the summit in a statement to the NATO Military Committee. He didn't enumerate what the 8 were, but there were hints at a variety of these. And taking my cue from that and also the influences I've just mentioned, I would expect to see some of the following. The predictable, a long statement on Russia, which is fairly traditional in NATO summits, with criticisms of Russian action in Ukraine, the recent SolarWinds hack, fairly standard stuff. We will probably see a statement on China, a little longer than that in the London summit of 2019, but mentioned also in code as well, rather than explicitly, by reference to resilience, space security, disruptive technologies and the like, many of which allude to NATO's need to take more serious attention of China. I think there will be quite a significant paragraph on Afghanistan. Afghanistan was the reason Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense of the US, visited Brussels in April. And there was an important NATO statement on Afghanistan, gearing up, and it's already started, to withdraw the Resolute Support Mission. I think there'll be a more political headline-y type statement. We may even get an annex in the summit meeting specifically on Afghanistan. I think we'll have a bit more in Iraq, the expansion of the mission in Iraq. I think we will see formal approval to start a revision of the 2010 strategic concept. I think we'll have a statement on climate change. It may be fairly narrow in scope, looking at how climate affects national militaries. And I think lastly, we're probably going to have some quite prominent statement or language on values. And this is because it accords with the Biden approach to foreign policy. It also is a way of distinguishing NATO from China in the emerging standoff between what we used to call the West and China. And also because I think, oddly, this is important to the United Kingdom at the moment. The United Kingdom is seeking a handle post-Brexit, and the UK likes to talk up its role in promoting the international rule-based order and so on. And of course, Denmark, Canada, Germany, Norway always regard those issues as important too. So I think we'll have a big statement on values. And I think part of that is I think there'll be something quite prominent on WPS as well. So that might be the surprise, a very welcome one, but not normally one sees in a summit declaration. So right, that's where I stand. Okay,
thank you very much. That was almost a whole communique. So fantastic, thank you. We'll go swiftly on to you, Jamie. What do you think we can expect?
Well, first of all, Trine, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Great to be with Mark again. Always a difficult act to follow because he knows NATO better than many practitioners who work in the organisation know NATO. And I think he's just proven that by really not missing anything out of his magistral description of what's on the agenda for the summit. And also, I'm delighted to be the president of the Centre for War Studies. I've always dreamed of being president of something in my life, and I can't think of anything I'd rather be president of than the Centre for War Studies. So thanks for that. I'm not going to contradict Mark in any way because I think what he said is totally on the ball. But I'll try to cast it in my own terms so it doesn't simply come across as a repetition of what he said. I mean, I think in the first place, the key thing for Biden is to simply reassert the US commitment to the defense of NATO. Now, this may seem like a sort of a no-brainer because Biden has made several statements to that effect since he became president. But as Mark said, this is his first NATO summit since he was elected, his first overseas trip, and it's okay to do it in media interviews, but it's important to do it in the North Atlantic Council chamber with all of the allies present, particularly at a moment, Mark indicated this, when they're very nervous about Russia's behavior, the recent military buildup on the border with Ukraine, the harassment of NATO forces, the Russian buildup in the Arctic, the Russian attempt to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake, what went on in Belarus and whether Russia was complicit in the hijacking of the aircraft. You know, a lot of the allies are nervous about Russia, and so they would always want a NATO summit to be used by the US president to do what Trump signally always refused to do, which was to commit publicly to the Article 5 collective defense guarantee. But particularly at this moment, I think they'll want to hear that, and not just the allies who feel most exposed in the Baltic or region or Central and Eastern Europe. Secondly, I think they'll want to hear from the president this promise that he's going to consult the allies on all of the big issues. I mean, again, the Trump years were years where you learned of a major policy decision affecting NATO, like withdrawal from Afghanistan or the removal of 12,000 US troops from Germany in the morning tweet with no prior warning or consultation. Or, for example, the way that France was exposed when the US decided to, or Trump decided to withdraw the US forces from Syria. So as Mark indicated, Biden has made a good start on Afghanistan by consulting the allies. Blinken and Austin, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, have been in Brussels twice. So I think there'll be this promise, look, you know, guys, we're not going to do things behind your back. We'll consult with you. That doesn't mean to say that the US will always keep that commitment. For example, it announced yesterday a summit in Geneva with Putin on the 16th of June without consulting the allies in advance. So there are going to be lapses, but in the main, this sense that, you know, we'll do things together, as with Afghanistan, in together, out together. One thing that Mark did not mention, and this is not a reproach, Mark, because you've got to leave me something to say, but one thing he didn't mention, I think the allies will be looking for more US commitments to collective defense in Europe. Biden was recently on a call with 9 leaders from NATO countries called the Bucharest 9 from Central and Eastern Europe. There's a strong feeling, I mentioned the Black Sea, that NATO is a bit light in that region. A lot of the focus after Russia annexed Crimea was on the Baltic region. They would like to have an equivalent sort of posture of headquarters, of rotational troops, of air defense, fighter aircraft, ships deployed in that region. And they've called on the US to deploy forces there. So it would be interesting to see if Biden gives an indication that he's willing to do that. He, of course, has done good things already, like setting up a couple of bases in Norway, which is new, cancelling Trump's decision to pull the 12,000 US troops out of Germany, adding 500 more. But I think, many allies would look for more American F-35 fighter jets in the Baltic region, more air defense assets, counter-artillery assets, participation in exercises. It'd be interesting to see if Biden thinks I've done enough already, or whether he's going to bring a few goodies, if you like, in his knapsack in terms of more US commitments there. On Afghanistan, Mark mentioned this. I think this is important because, of course, the withdrawal is only part of the issue, because there is then the question of, well, what do you do with Afghanistan, and how do you influence the security situation, and how do you prevent the government collapsing and the Taliban taking back control if you don't have troops on the ground? And the Americans are working very hard on this. They call it over the horizon deterrence, trying to get bases in Central Asia. Pakistan said no to them yesterday, or bases in the Middle East. Stoltenberg has said we're not deserting Afghanistan, we're going to somehow continue the training. But how can you do it if you're not in Afghanistan? For example, NATO has got some centers in the Gulf, in Jordan, in Kuwait. Could it use those to train the Afghan army? Will allies put millions, potentially billions of dollars over the years into trust funds? So how's NATO going to do it? I don't know if the summit will give us good answers, because, as I mentioned, the US thinking really hasn't matured on this yet. But allies, and I think Mark's right, will be looking at least for some indications from Biden how he thinks he's going to square this magic circle. China and the Indo-Pacific, I think, is going to be the really big question mark. And Mark mentioned this. I mean, some US commentators that I listen to point out that NATO is America's foremost security alliance, which is not dealing with America's foremost security concern, which is China. They call it in Washington strategic misalignment, a wonderful term. And NATO, as Mark pointed out, has been looking at China, performing studies, thinking about China. But what would the US be asking NATO to do? Will it be essentially to sort of analyze China's role in NATO, i.e. in the Euro-Atlantic area, in the Arctic, in the Mediterranean, in terms of one belt, one road kind of investments, the whole Huawei 5G telecommunications issue, dependence upon Chinese technology? Will it be, keep an eye on China when it comes to you? Or will Biden actually start asking NATO allies to do what the Brits have done this week, which is to send the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier, brand new, with a task force off to the South China Sea and to the Indo-Pacific on a freedom of navigation type of exercise? And how would the Europeans respond if suddenly, a second big beast is added to the NATO agenda? I mean, I know NATO from the time that I was there, and it's good at dealing with one problem in one place at one time, whether it would be the Balkans or Libya or Afghanistan or more recently Russia. But NATO has never had to deal with two massive strategic competitors who are very different in terms of the challenge that they represent at the same time. And of course, Biden can't come to Brussels and say, guys, we're taking Russia out and we're putting China in. That clearly is not going to work. The alliance and many of its members, even the UK in its integrated review, are still overwhelmingly focused on Russia. But how do we create space in the alliance for China? I heard a very senior former British official in the House of Lords yesterday on a call propose that NATO could be, if you like, the hub where the global democracies meet, including the Asia-Pacific democracies, and consult on overall Grand China strategy. He said, where else can we do this? Others are more skeptical. So I think that's going to be the joker in the pack to watch out for. Finally, Mark quite rightly mentioned all of this basket of issues. I won't repeat them because he described them extremely well, which are part of the Secretary General's NATO 2030 initiative, and which came out of a report of a group of experts that prepared the way. last year, and which would lead to a new strategic concept. Some of these seem to be going down, like the sugar and the medicine in Mary Poppins quite smoothly, like a greater NATO role dealing with climate change, particularly the greening of the NATO military. Others are slightly more contentious. For example, Stoltenberg's idea for more collective finance in NATO, collective funding of missions. Some allies like France don't like that because they think that it would be a way of paying twice. We pay for ourselves and then we have to subsidize others. Another idea which may run into a little bit of resistance, and Mark mentioned this, is on resilience. Everybody agrees that NATO has to look at resilience, but if NATO starts setting very stringent resilience targets on its member states, you have to do this or else, they may feel, no, this is our own national prerogative. NATO shouldn't be telling us what to do. It should be setting the standards, but leave it to us to meet them. Another idea is to set up within NATO's military command a new training command to do capability building. Mark mentioned Iraq and elsewhere. Again, everybody agrees that NATO should do capability building, but do we need a big new sort of military bureaucracy in the form of a new command, or can the existing command structure do it? So interesting to see, which of these 8 proposals go down well, which maybe don't, and to what degree the Allies are now ready to turn Stoltenberg's NATO 2030 initiative into a new strategic concept. I understand from my sources that the Allies have already agreed to hold another summit in Spain in 2022, where presumably this strategic concept could be done and dusted for approval. I would mention just in closing, Trine, and I've abused my 5 minutes, but Mark abused his 5 minutes as well, which is just to add Russia. As Mark pointed out, Putin will be meeting Biden in Geneva the day after he leaves Brussels, and I'm sure that lots of allies will want to give him advice. The advice from the Eastern Europeans will probably be tough, be firm. Putin is a real menace. But countries like Italy, Germany, France that have tried to have good relations with Russia while recognizing the problems may also be hoping that this dialogue can be productive in areas which count for them. For example, notably nuclear weapons, strategic arms control, more transparency on exercises, and hoping, as I say, that it won't just be giving Putin a lecture or calling him a killer, as Biden did on the media recently, but trying to come out with something that shows that a more stable relationship is not a pipe dream. Thank you.
Wow. I'm not sure. Well, time flies when you're having fun, that's for sure. And I'm afraid we only have 2 minutes left. And we have got a really good question that I don't think you can possibly do justice in the time that is left. But what we did get out of this, I think, is really comprehensive statements from 2 absolutely experts on NATO with a bid on what to expect at the summit next month. Now, just for you to sort of think about, and perhaps we have a question from Henrik Lindboe Larsen, who is asking about the need to delineate what NATO as a defense alliance can realistically do when it comes to liberal values. And I very much echo what Henrik is asking about, because it seems to me that one of the big things that needs to be addressed is the continuation of shared liberal values in NATO. What's going to be the big sticking point? And I'm going to take an executive decision here to allow us another 5 minutes, even though we said this was just going to be 30 minutes, it will be 35 minutes. So you have just literally 1 minute to think about the role of delineating the liberal values in NATO in the forthcoming strategic concept.
Shall I go first on that?
Yes, please.
Yeah. It's a difficult question on the one hand, but on the other, a very simple one, in the sense that, and this may sound blunt, I mean, ultimately, the NATO is not the Council of Europe. It is not the repository of the European Convention on Human Rights. Its job is to defend liberal values in a sense at one step remove. So in other words, it is in almost every regard, an alliance of liberal states. And the defense of the interests of those liberal states in aggregation is what it does. There are important occasions where values drive action, the intervention in Kosovo, for instance. And NATO also serves a very important function by advertising the significance of those values in its founding treaty and in its benchmark statements, of which the strategic concept is one. But I am not an advocate of allowing liberal values to determine chapter and verse of NATO policy, because to do so, I think, sends NATO back to probably where it was around about 2010, 2012, at a time when actually Jamie wrote about overstretch. I recently wrote about overstretch, and there is always the danger, if you follow values, you end up overstretched, overcommitted, lacking focus, and so on. So I think values are important to advertise, but to defend in constrained and well-defined circumstances, which I think the treaty already provides for in Articles 3, 4, and 5, and 6 in particular. So I realize that's a slightly politician's answer, but I think too much of an emphasis on values could lead NATO into chasing dragons.
Okay. Thank you. Jamie, what's your answer to this?
Again, I really think Mark gave a textbook answer, and were he not there, I would be happy to plagiarize it and pretend that I thought of it. But no, I think he's right. I mean, NATO has two weaknesses when it comes to values. Number one, as Mark says, it's not the Council of Europe. It doesn't have an institutional role to deal with values. And secondly, of course, with Hungary, Turkey, one could argue Poland at the moment, although the United States is looking in much better shape, but it's not necessarily the best moment in NATO's history to start trumpeting values. I think Mark's right. Given that the Biden administration wants to organize a summit of democracies, and Boris Johnson has spoken of the D10, the Democratic 10, there will be a push to put these in the statement somehow, ritualistically. But I agree with Mark that I think it's better for NATO to talk about stability, security, rule of law, cooperative international order, the things that are on the sidelines of values, but are in the sort of pragmatic area where NATO can argue that it's had some success. It may also be more convincing to talk about this in terms of what NATO is going to come up with to make sure that women and children in Afghanistan no longer come under the ferocious rule of the Taliban, and what practically we're going to do to avoid a backslide there. For many people who look at values, and I know Mark is also focused on Afghanistan, trying to come up with a credible strategy there may be more convincing than talking about values in a rather sort of abstract sense in the NATO communique.
Thank you very much. I suspect that Henrik is not very happy about that answer, and I'm not sure that I am either. I tend to think that values is actually the lifeblood of NATO, and that is what it says in the preamble of the treaty as well, to protect democracy, rule of law, and liberty. I can't remember. So I would probably disagree with you there, and I wish we had another half hour to discuss this and some of all those other issues that you raised, because my God, there's a lot of issues to get into. So I wish we had more time, but we have settled on this half-hour format, and I guess we probably should stick with it. But I don't think this is the last time that I will ask you to come and talk about NATO at the Center for War Studies. I think there's definitely some potential there for lots of other different issues. So can I just say thank you very much for joining, both to our two speakers and also to our small, but I am sure very high quality audience that we have on here. And of course, this session has been recorded, so it's also possible to come back to it and to listen to it at a later stage. So thank you very much. And for those of you who have an interest in more Insight Conversations, the next one is on the 1st of June, and it will be between Sten Rynning and Rolf Holbro, who's the ambassador to Mali, and they will be talking about stabilization processes in the wake of withdrawing from Afghanistan. So, so until then, thank you for joining, and see you soon. Thank you.